Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 266 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Whether we're aware of it or not, we as global citizens owe a whole lot to the work of a handful of scholars working in Central Asia 1,000 years ago. Experimenting, translating, and philosophizing about physics and metaphysics, biology and geology, these thinkers took what we knew about the world and pushed it further, making discoveries that would be fundamental to our knowledge and understanding for hundreds of years. And within this group of intellectual heavyweights, two stand out both for their achievements and their completely opposite points of view. This week, I spoke with Dr. S. Frederick Starr about the work and the lives of Ibn Sina, aka Avicenna, and Biruni. Fred is founding chairman of the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute and Silk Road Studies program, and the author and co-author of many books, including Looking Forward, Kazakhstan and the United States, and The Lost Enlightenment, Central Asia's Golden Age from the Arab Conquest to Tamerlane. His new book is The Genius of Their Age, Ibn Sina, Biruni, and the Lost Enlightenment. Our conversation on these two intellectual giants, their contributions to science and culture, and the reason they outright despised each other is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Fred, for joining me to talk about two of the greatest thinkers of the Middle Ages. It is a pleasure to meet you. Welcome to the podcast.
It's a delight to be here.
I am happy to have you. So we are talking about two scholars, and we're going to get into their work in a second. But first of all, where are we talking about, and when are we talking about when we're talking about these two men?
Well, first, when? They lived in the 10th and early 11th century. In other words, before the Norman conquest in England. On the eve of it, actually. And where they were on the move because they had no choice. They lived in very nasty times. Mm-hmm. But their geography included the present-day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and especially Afghanistan. Biruni did most of his work in what is now Afghanistan. And Ibn Sina was constantly on the run. Both of them. We think of scholars and scientists sort of sitting peacefully in their labs and looking at test tubes and charts and stuff like that. These two poor guys were geniuses of their age, but they were constantly checking over their shoulder because they didn't enjoy a whit of security, which makes their achievement all the more amazing. I mean, scientists nowadays with their grants and their big subsidized laboratories, no, they made all their own equipment and they had very little support in the big sense. I mean, for example, Biruni, who did astonishing work in the field of astronomy, he built a telescope, but it was only, he was 2/3 of the way through with his career before he had such a piece of equipment, before anyone would pay for it. Mm-hmm. Now, he also built 2 globes. We say the globes, he had everything on them that was known at the time, and both of them were destroyed, of course.
Yeah.
So it wasn't easy, and poor Ibn Sina, from his mid-30s on, was constantly on the run. He moved from one city to the next, hoping that he'd get a good job in the civil as a senior minister, actually, a senior official. And he'd get the job for a couple of years, and pretty soon the politics would close in on him and he'd be off on the road again. So security, their achievements, amazing as they are even more astonishing when you consider the total lack of security that they both suffered from throughout their lives.
Yes, it's incredible because this is a time in which you actually call this the Lost Enlightenment, which is throwback to some other work that you have done in this time and place, talking about the scholars that were revered. They were so revered, and at the same time, always on the run, always looking for money. This is kind of familiar, I think, to a lot of scholars today.
It was much rougher.
Yeah.
Both of them it's not common nowadays that a scientist or scholar has to deal with threat of being beheaded.
That is true.
Both of them were at one point or another.
Hmm.
They lived in rough times, and the times were rough because there were two big issues going on. One was the shift of control of the great trading cities of Central Asia from Persianate people who spoke languages related to Persian but different to Turkic people. And the key figure of the Turkic side during both their lives, and after all, they were exact contemporaries, the key figure was a truly nasty figure named Mahmud. And Mahmud of Ghazni. Now, Ghazni is a town that's an hour or so south of Kabul today in Afghanistan. And it was during their lifetime, it became the center of a huge empire. And the guy running it, Mahmud himself, was, I would say, one of the nastier rulers of the Middle Ages anywhere.
Hmm.
And he wanted both of them. That's the interesting thing. Nowadays, if you are a successful ruler anywhere, you want nice publicity in the press and you want maybe an international prize or two. Back then, if you had really made it as a ruler, you accumulated thinkers and poets and writers. The poets spent all their time writing poetry about the ruler, of course.
Yes.
The scientists did their work and or didn't do their work, but the idea was to collect them. This was proof that you made it.
Hmm.
And Mahmud wanted to collect both of these guys. And he actually got Biruni, who spent 3 decades under Mahmud's not loving care. And Mahmud almost got Ibn Sina. He chased after him through city after city, and they missed by a hair.
Hmm.
So they were under the gun throughout their creative life.
Yeah, it's such an interesting almost contradiction. You collect these great thinkers and yet really put fetters on them in some ways, saying, here's what you have to do with your life. And you can't really explore too far from that. Although Biruni did some really interesting work, I think before he was collected by Mahmud, where he was
And
looking.
after,
Yes, but I'm thinking about the times when he was actually, in some ways, critical of the work of Muhammad, which is really kind of edgy to be doing at that time. So he was a great thinker and an edgy thinker, and it must have been very difficult to be working under someone like Mahmud.
well, you had to earn the boss's respect. We're speaking about Biruni sitting in Ghazni under Mahmud. You had to earn his respect. It could be grudging respect, but he had to respect you. And there are a lot of stories that survive as to how Biruni gained Mahmud's respect. One of the most interesting is that they were sitting on a terrace of a building having tea in the late afternoon, and they got to talking about prophecy and about whether anyone had the power to predict the future. And Biruni very casually said, well, I'll tell you, I know which door you're going to leave here via and where you're going. And Mahmud was absolutely infuriated by that. And it later turned out that he, in fact, did predict how Mahmud would leave that terrace. And Mahmud was so peeved, so it is said. We can't be sure of this, but it was said at that time that Mahmud had him chucked over the terrace and probably landed in the bushes below. But that is the kind of encounter that created grudging respect on Mahmud's part. And I'm sure he respected Ibn Sina just as much. He chased after him all over what is now Iran. And at one point, actually got a lot of his manuscripts, which were taken back to Afghanistan, to Ghazni, but they didn't catch Ibn Sina himself. And to protect himself from Mahmud, first he fled. When Mahmud was closing in with a huge army, with piles of elephants and so on, closing in on this town in what is now Turkmenistan, Kunyar Gench, it's called today. Mahmud is closing in on this. This was the last great Persianate center in what is now Central Asia, and the Turk, Mahmud, very primitive, but with a very large army, a pile of elephants, closes in on the town. Well, Ibn Sina lights out early. He just goes through the desert. And actually, one of the people he traipsed across the desert with died in a sandstorm, but he barely made it alive. And poor Biruni was captured. And of course, he was literally marched back to Afghanistan. I can't emphasize enough that here are two of the greatest thinkers between ancient Greece and Rome on the one hand, and the Renaissance on the other, who enjoyed none of the security that our scientists and thinkers today take for granted.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so while we're talking about these scholars, we haven't actually got too much into their scholarship. So maybe this is a good moment to sort of situate them in the scholarship that they have done. So Ibn Sina is probably the easiest place to start because he's more familiar, I think, to medievalists these days. His name was anglicized to Avicenna or Latinized to Avicenna, so people might know him better by that name. But Ibn Sina, tell us a little bit about what he did, what he worked on throughout his life.
Well, what they had in common, these two contemporaries from the late 10th and early 11th century, what they had in common was to have grown up absorbed with the work of Aristotle and the scientific work of Aristotle. Interestingly, and this is extremely important and never pointed out, all the other works of Aristotle, all the works that we would call scientific, they were translated into Arabic, often by Syrian Christians, who, of course, were Arab speakers, and they knew both languages, both Greek and through the church, and Arabic from their daily life. And they did a lot of the translating. Other translations were done in Baghdad by Arabs. But my point is this: that growing up in that era, a highly educated and sophisticated person was expected to know the main works of Aristotle.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is never pointed out, and what I think is of just immense importance, is that Aristotle's politics were never translated.
Mm-hmm.
How different the world might have been had the medieval Muslim world known of Aristotle's politics. And in his politics, Aristotle was not floating around in, big abstract concepts and so on. He was a researcher. He went and studied city after city, state after state, to see how they actually worked. And unfortunately, neither of these guys got into the politics, nor did the Arabic speaking population of the Muslim world. That was left out. It's one of the great unfortunate moments of medieval history. But my point is that they reacted to Aristotle differently. Ibn Sina basically wanted to become a modern Aristotle. Aristotle, after all, they both agreed, he tied up everything known in his era. And he did. I mean, you name it, Aristotle opined on it, and very intelligently and very interestingly. And Ibn Sina, who was a very proud guy, very full of himself in a way, Ibn Sina basically, steadily in the course of his career, assumed the role of the modern Aristotle, the guy who is transcending Aristotle. And that meant creating a closed, complete system. All knowledge is neatly arranged and so forth. Now, Biruni also knew his Aristotle, and he knew a lot of the other classical writers too, Ptolemy and so forth. But Biruni took a totally different tack. He wanted to test the ancient writers, and Ibn Sina wanted to do that too. He wanted to go beyond them. But Biruni took them as a starting point, but only as a starting point. And in his further investigations, he said, well, now look, how do we prove what we know. And here's where the two guys went in very different directions. Ibn Sina said, if you want to prove something, it has to accord with the principles of Platonic and Aristotelian logic. It has to fit syllogisms. In other words, the structure of the argument for him was crucially important. It was the center of everything. Even his medicine, he goes back to syllogisms and proofs of that sort. Biruni, by contrast, said, no, if you want to prove something, give me the math. If you don't have the numbers, it can't be proven. You may be very enthusiastic about a particular position, but it ain't proven. And this made Ibn Sina the consummation of the ancient and medieval world, but it made Biruni a precursor of the very modern world. Very fascinating. And of course, this difference between how you prove something between these two geniuses, and they're both geniuses, let's admit it. This difference lay at the bottom of everything. And this is why they truly couldn't get along. Of course, they being of the same age and being both of them growing up surrounded by praise and what a smart young guy you are, all this, it was inevitable that these two young males would have duked it out. But the more they did, the more they realized that they fundamentally disagreed. And that's why the juxtaposition of them is so fascinating. It shows how rich, intellectually rich, that lost enlightenment was in Central Asia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really incredible to look at their stuff. And when I look at Ibn Sina's work, I can follow it pretty well. The logical arguments, they work with the type of brain that I have. I'm always impressed by not only the ancients, but the medieval world and how you test things like the math. So Biruni was really interested, especially in how the world works, how you measure the globe, how you measure the distance between cities, and the ways that he works this out were just incredible.
They are indeed. But in all fairness, Ibn Sina was good at math. He wasn't an outsider to that world and used it on a lot of things. And there were indeed quite a few areas where the two of them came to similar conclusions. For example, on geology, they both figured out how sediments grew. They understood that very different versions of the earth had existed earlier, and various cataclysms had shaped what we now know. On these points, they were pretty much on the same page. But Ibn Sina, first of all, it's hard to imagine so grand an aspiration. He wanted to pull everything knowable under one system. And a lot more was known in 1000 AD than in Aristotle's time. He wanted to pull it all under one logically coherent system. And think of it. That includes theology, it includes philosophy, it includes mathematics, you name it, medicine, everything. And he more or less accomplished this, which is a staggering achievement. Now, Biruni also made absolutely, in some respects, even more staggering discoveries. For example, when he measured the diameter of the Earth more accurately than, of course, it was round, that was not under discussion, but he measured it more accurately than anyone down to the 17th century. Now, how did he do that? Well, it involved very sophisticated mathematical work, and it involved the use of sign tables. Now, sign law had been discovered or invented and developed mainly in India, which caused Biruni to become fascinated with India and to write one of the pioneering works of, if you will, political science, intellectual, cultural history, anywhere up to that time on India. But the sign tables he used, and this is the main point, he didn't just borrow, look in Google sign tables and paste them into his research. No, he developed his own sign tables. And then he applied these to his estimates and measurements of the Earth, which were done through very extraordinarily simple, extremely sophisticated method involving triangles and sine tables and so forth, to measure it with astonishing accuracy. And then he went on to measure the distance from the Earth to the moon and would have gone on to the sun, but it didn't get to that.
Yeah, I mean, he comes across as sort of the consummate scientist in that he actually burned his eyes watching a solar eclipse because he had to know, he had to see it for himself. I do think it's important that the point that you mentioned that we can't say that Avicenna was just book learned in that he was a physician and a lot of his observations come from actual practice as well. So it's not just coming from books. Both of these men got their hands dirty and read the books at the same time.
I think that's a very important point. Ibn Sina was a practicing doctor. I mean, he practiced everything, but
Yeah.
including medicine. And any reader who gets, especially if you're a doctor in the field of medicine somehow, they should take a look at his his 5 thick volumes on a modern shelf in translation, his 5-volume work on medicine. It
Hmm.
was from Europe. It was early translated into Latin all the way to India. For 600 years, Ibn Sina's great work on medicine was the gospel. This is what everyone down to the 17th century in England or France or Europe or India or anywhere in between, this is what they all started with.
Hmm.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. And especially one of the things that you mentioned in the book is when he started writing the canon of medicine, he was living in a backwater. He had like almost no job. It was a low, low point for him. And yet out of it comes the canon of medicine. It's pretty,
And though, interestingly, in the end, he considered this just something he tossed off.
yeah.
And his more, he thought, more important and enduring work had to do with philosophy and theology.
Hmm.
And his writings on theology were so insightful that they were early translated into both into Hebrew and into Latin. And as a result, Maimonides, a great Jewish thinker, owed a debt to Ibn Sina, and also St. Thomas Aquinas. If you check his footnotes,
Yeah.
Thomas Aquinas didn't borrow, he drew gratefully on Ibn Sina on quite a number of points. Now, here is something very interesting. He was operating at such a high level, beyond culture, if you will, that both Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers could embrace key elements of his thought.
Hmm.
Imagine. Now, eventually, a lot of Muslim thinkers rejected it because it was too open a system for them. They wanted everything fixed according to specific texts, either in the Holy Writ, if you will, in the Quran, or in what were called the sayings of Muhammad. And they thought every problem of life could be solved by either of those two texts. And the kind of speculation and going so far afield that Ibn Sina engaged in was for some Muslims, traditionalists, who were mainly, by the way, Sunni, not Shia. For many of them, he therefore became unacceptable. But he never lost his following in the Muslim world. Unfortunately, Biruni wasn't so fortunate because Ibn Sina was writing on fashionable topics like medicine and so on. So any new work out of Ibn Sina's pen got copied, which means published, and therefore they send it on a caravan that's going east, west, north, or south, and copies were preserved all over the place of many more writings by Ibn Sina than by Biruni. Biruni was sitting in Ghazni in the middle of Afghanistan. It was a hugely important political center, but not a commercial center in the same sense. And so you didn't have traders who could say, well, sure, I'll take that manuscript. I'm going there anyway, just throw it on the camel. Uh, that didn't happen. And so fewer of his works went into circulation at the time, and he was operating further east than was Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina, after he was chased out of what is now Turkmenistan, went especially into various cities in Iran, in Persia, whereas Biruni headed southeast to what is now Afghanistan, not voluntarily, but that's where he headed. Now, the result is that when the Mongols came through a few centuries later, they destroyed all the libraries where most of Biruni's works were preserved. I mean, we know there was a great city out in Turkmenistan called Merv today, MERV, a huge and enormous commercial center. And we know because a visitor there, I think in the 12th century, indicated in his writings that I was so happy I found, I don't know, 36 works by Biruni in such and such a library. Well, that library was destroyed by the Mongols, as were all the others. Much less was preserved, and it didn't go into the bloodstream the way Ibn Sina did. But they're
Yes.
both geniuses.
Yeah, welcome to medieval studies. I think that that's one of the points that you're making where you can draw from, in the Middle Ages, you can draw from different schools of thought, and it's not necessarily theologically a problem. That is very characteristic of the Middle Ages. So I'm glad that you brought that up. So there was speculation for many centuries that maybe these two had spoken to each other, but people weren't sure of that until some letters were found that talk about that reveal
Oh,
a
yeah. Well, that's
discussion.
how I think anyone who thinks of these two men in relationship to each other has to go back to square one, which is, for me, it was square one. And that when I was writing Lost Enlightenment on the Central Asia's golden age in the 8th to 11th century, when I was writing that, I came across a correspondence between these two guys. They were both young, they were in their 20s. And each of them had been pampered and given the best possible education. Each was recognized as a kind of wunderkind or genius at a very tender age. And because they were all under the rule of what was then Bukhara, the great city of Bukhara, where Ibn Sina was actually from there. But Biruni grew up in the north at a city that was washed away by flood. Biruni and Ibn Sina both heard of each other early, and it really bothered each of them, these young men, that there could be another guy who could also be considered a genius. And we believe that Biruni initiated the correspondence. And I think he might have done it on serious grounds because he was asking Ibn Sina about a few technical points on Aristotle's philosophy. Well, Ibn Sina wrote back, but even in his first response, it had an edge. And by the next exchange, they were soundly abusing each other. And how could anyone with any sense write what you just sent me, this sort of thing? Then they ended up, and this is why I wrote the book, they ended up purely by accident in both cases in a new city that is now near the Aral Sea, the dying sea, in western Uzbekistan and northern Turkmenistan. This is desert. This is absolute blank today. They both ended up in the town of Kunya-Urgench, which was just coming into its own as a great commercial and political center. It was only in its own for about 30 years under these new rulers, but they were both there in the court. And we know they were both there at the same time for 7 years. And there's not a shred of evidence of their directly interacting. Now, this would be, I mean, we're talking about two guys living in a town, let's say in northern Alberta, with a court, a new court, run by the leader, the ruler of Kunyargench was a young guy, not that much older than they were. And obviously, there were ceremonies every day, and they'd have formal dinners and they'd have receptions and they'd have garden parties and everything. We know they were both there because other people who were there mentioned both of them and some of them were friends with both, but not one mention ever by either of them later. So you could imagine this kind of freeze that set in. And what is interesting is that this fundamental difference between the testing of truth by logic and testing of truth by mathematics, this difference between them only deepened and spread, and it turned out to be enormously productive for both of them. Disagreement can be very good. It can challenge you and so on. And for these two geniuses, it was. And therefore, to follow their separate, very separate, they never saw each other again. There's no evidence that they ever communicated with each other. There's, I would say, fragile evidence that they aimed some barbs at each other later. Each was very much continued to be aware. I mean, Biruni sitting in Afghanistan, he was following Ibn Sina's latest work. Ibn Sina surely knew what was going on in Biruni. And so this went on for a lifetime. And thanks to it, if you take them together, they vastly expanded and deepened human knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And had they been all chummy and on the same wavelength, this probably wouldn't have happened.
Well, they seem like very different people in all senses of the word, like so that it's not just their thinking about thinking that is different, but even their lifestyles are very different. So when
Oh, my
when
goodness,
people
yes.
yes, when you think about or people look at Avicenna, they're like, look at these learned works. He was a bit of a cad. And yet Biruni is staying at home and he's working. He's like, don't bother me, I'm doing math. And they're so polar opposite. It would be difficult to see them actually becoming best friends.
No, it's inconceivable. But Ibn Sina, now, this is a very important point you touch on. Ibn Sina, because his field was all knowledge, and that include the skills of governance. Well, he watched governance in his hometown of Bukhara, and he watched it up in Kunyar-Ganj, and then he fled into various cities in Iran and Persia, and each of which, because he was a very presentable guy and very smooth talker, I'm sure, and truly bright, of course, a genius. Everywhere he went, he was asked to fill some major post. So unfortunately, even though Ibn Sina moved from what we would call prime ministership or foreign ministership to the next foreign minister or prime ministership, he did this 3 times. Nonetheless, we don't have a single shred of authoritative information on what he actually did. This was his day gig,
Hmm.
and we ignore it. No one even asks, well, what were his concerns then? No, there's nothing written about Ibn Sina's day job. You know,
That's a great title for your next book.
well, well, but it is fascinating, not because all these archives were destroyed, but he obviously was doing real stuff in that department, as a foreign minister, as a chief advisor to the ruler. He was obviously very good at it. But he made some bad choices, which caused him to be hounded from one city to the next. But that happens in politics. Biruni, by contrast, basically, he knuckled under, built, as you suggested, a private realm for himself under Mahmud of Ghazna's protection. And he did all his work and managed to publish it and get it around. But of course, his interest was only spreading it to a few fellow techies.
Yeah.
Whereas Ibn Sina, he liked an audience.
Yeah, he wanted to be the rock star genius.
Well, he was. And he created an entire system of thought that really comprehended everything known at the time. it's easy today in the 21st century to be critical, say, well, it's a closed system. It doesn't invite further inquiries in any direction. He answered all the questions. And in that sense, there's something not modern about him. And in that sense, of course, Biruni comes out as a real champion. He, for example, had no doubt that the Earth moved around the sun. There was simply no question in his mind about this. He knew it. He wrote it, that he knew it. However, he knew that he could not prove this the way he had to prove everything mathematically, because to make the observations on the movement of the Earth and of the moon and the solar system that would establish the proof of a heliocentric as opposed to a geocentric universe. In order to do that, the alignment of heavenly bodies wouldn't meet that need for another 2 centuries. So he said, unfortunately, I can't prove it. He hypothesized it correctly. And, that's long. How many centuries before Copernicus?
Mm-hmm.
This is a very big deal. And he even made clear what you had to do in order to prove it. But he said, unfortunately, the solar system isn't cooperating with me, and you'll have to wait another couple of 100 years.
But then follow my instruction.
Yeah, follow my, yeah, you got it. You got it. So these were both what charmed me about them and what attracted me to them is they're both real people.
Mm-hmm.
They're not some obscure figures from the past that live only on the pages of a few dead histories. They're real people.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know whether I could learn enough about them to write, let alone to do a parallel biography. By the way, I stole that from Plutarch, the ancient writer who did parallel lives, always a Greek and a Roman, and compared them. I thought, oh, that's a good idea. I'll do the same with these two guys. But the problem is, in both cases, we have only a small fragment of their lifetime's work.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else is lost. Imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, approximately 3/4 of everything they wrote has disappeared. Now, there are still occasionally pieces found, and it's not ruled out that whole books will be discovered. More likely is that a few fragments of their writings will be picked up, lost writings will be picked up because later writers in the Middle Ages included them in something they wrote. But that's a pretty slim hope. I think we're stuck with the approximately a quarter of what they wrote. Imagine how we would view all this if we had 100%.
I mean, you could say that about so much of medieval studies. I mean,
Well, you really come out. I came out of studying these two guys with a deep respect for them. They were under the most adverse circumstances. They were asking all the big questions and fearless in attempting to answer them. Both had to dance very, very delicately over some of the big religious issues of the day, but both of them managed to do that very successfully in that neither of them had his head removed. But
that's a
but
win.
but what a different picture we would have of them and their era if we had even 50% of what was written, not just by them, but by others. I mean, I was astonished to discover, for me, it was a discovery. I knew him, but this great Persian medical guy, Razi,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
he was the guy that Ibn Sina had to surpass. His huge, huge treatise on medicine, much, much large, so large that no one could ever find their way around in it. But this huge, huge document was out there, and Ibn Sina's goal was to transcend it.
Mm-hmm.
Something much more coherent, structured, and accessible in its length. Ended up 5 volumes. Biruni also, he had all these ancient writers and more recent astronomers and mathematicians and so on. He knew them all. He especially found himself in awe of the Indians because in mathematics and astronomy, they have pioneered so many things, including, by the way, what we call Arabic numerals, which aren't Arabic at all. They're Arabic because Biruni and his teacher and others, not in the Arab world, but in the Persianate world of Central Asia, they were the ones that discovered all these Indian scientists and thinkers and borrowed what we call the decimal system of numbers, borrowed it. It should be called the Khwarezmian system or something like that, rather than Arabic numerals. But it, in fact, wasn't Khwarezmian either. It came traced back to India. And Biruni was relentless in going to the sources. He learned Indian languages. He could translate from Indian language. I mean, it's astonishing that he did that because he was dead set on, if someone had anticipated what he was trying to do, he wanted to know what they did and how they did it. This is something, it's so modern, it's impressive. And for him to do it, by the way, was not, for a guy in the Muslim world to be admiringly studying India. This was at the time when his own boss, Mahmud, was raping and pillaging across India. He was destroying the place.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, Biruni used that opportunity to deepen his knowledge of India and wrote what is arguably one of the pioneering works of sociology, anthropology, you name it,
Yeah.
called India.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm so glad that you wrote this book and I was able to have you on the podcast because I think it's always important, even for people who have been studying the Middle Ages for a long time, to remind ourselves of just how innovative people were throughout history, constantly coming up with new ways to expand our knowledge. So thank you so much for coming on and talking about these two great thinkers. It's been a pleasure.
It's my pleasure. What an honor to share all this with people as knowledgeable as you and your audience.
Thank you. To find out more about Fred's work, you can visit the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute's page at cacianalyst.org. His new book is The Genius of Their Age, Ibn Sina, Biruni, and the Lost Enlightenment. Before we go, here's Peter from Medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on this week, Peter?
Hey, are you interested in getting a new dog name?
Well, I don't want to get another dog, so I think I'm going to hold off for now.
But
Why do you ask?
You could rename it your dog because I have 1,065 dog names from the Middle Ages.
Wow, that is way too many dogs for me to hold on to. But what kind of names have we got?
Well, this is like a late 15th century Middle English source. It's in amongst all these works about veterinarian care and dealing with horses and falconry. And there's all of a sudden this big list. So they've got names like Digger, Holdfast, Charlemagne.
Charlemagne, yeah.
Yes. Pretty Boy. And my favorite is Make It Good.
Make it good.
Yeah.
I can't imagine yelling that across the yard.
It all comes from an article that was published, like a dozen years ago, but this list is out there. Usually most medieval sources, they don't even name the dogs, but the author was kind of discussing how, like, if you're a trainer, you probably do need to keep them in mind and, figure out who's who and stuff like that. But I think 1,065 seems to be overdoing it.
Well, I think that's fascinating. There's got to be something there. Well, if you look on the internet, you can still see lists of 1,000 dog names at once. And I remember this because when we were naming our dog, we went through a bunch of these lists because I had to get everyone to agree on this. And so 1,000 dog names might be just enough in the end.
Yeah, just enough. Like, the funny part is it was originally 1,060, and then someone in the 16th century just added 5 more.
Why not?
So we have that piece. It's actually getting a lot of interest. A lot of people want to rename their dog, I think, because of this.
Yes, they're naming their dogs because of medievalist.net. It's a great service that you're doing there, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you. We also have the story of King Arthur's Hall. In Cornwall, in this kind of random field, is this rectangular mini field with the standing stones all around it. And History England thought it was like, hey, this is a medieval fence or yard or something like that. It got the name King Arthur's Hall. So, people had Arthurian connections to it. But archaeologists went in and did some sampling and figured out it's actually 5,500 years old.
Wow. So, I mean, the standing stones are a bit of a clue, right? But still.
Indeed. So yeah, now we have what was once thought to be a medieval is prehistoric. So I guess King Arthur is prehistoric.
Sure. He is whatever you want him to be. That is what I've learned.
That is so true. That is so true. So we got all those stories plus much, much more.
Well, thank you, Peter, for stopping by and giving us inspiration into dog names and, of course, a whole lot more on King Arthur. Thank you. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you, as always, to each and every one of you who supports this podcast through letting the ads play through, spreading the word, proudly wearing a 5-minute medievalist shirt from tpublic.com, or signing up at patreon.com. My work would not be possible without your support, so thank you. If you'd like to become a patron to help me keep the awesome medieval content coming, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from scholars to ballers, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.